Okay, so I'm just going to welcome everyone to this third open discussion on the topic of moving Ireland towards being neurodevelopmentally aware and trauma responsive. And tonight we've three excellent contributors. I'm really grateful to the three ladies who have agreed to speak. And Caroline Martin is going to kick off with some reflections about systems and the position of the individual vis-a-vis systems. At least that's what I think you're going to talk about, Caroline. So the floor is yours. Welcome and thanks very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. Jane, I just want to check with you, how long do I have to talk?
10 minutes-ish.
Ish, right, okay, great. I say that because I suppose, you start these things and you think, I'll probably say everything in 2 minutes and then I'll be here a half an hour later. So yeah, exactly. So I suppose just to thank you so much for the invitation to come today, Jane, and also thank you for, I suppose, putting this kind of group together and making this virtual floor a space that we can kind of come and share ideas and experiences and thoughts and towards that kind of idea of, I suppose, a more compassionate Ireland, perhaps. I really enjoyed the chat that we had there a couple of weeks ago. It was really lovely and I liked the energy that was there. So I really don't want to kind of deviate too much from the style of the speakers because they were so lovely and they were so generous and kind with their thinking and with their own thoughts and that. So I suppose it's kind of with that kind of idea that I said that I really would like to talk about systems and systemic trauma in particular. Because I suppose for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a counselling psychologist by trade. It's kind of bizarre because I'm a counselling psychologist. I've actually worked in education for over 20 years until very recently. And then I recently, just before Christmas there, resigned my post as the chief psychologist of the City Dublin ETB and decided I would try carving out my own path. And part of that, I suppose, was my response to my experience of, I suppose, the whole public service system and trying to be kind of an agitator within it and kind of coming up against different kind of struggles. And I'm sure that those are going to be, I suppose, they resonate with so many people who work within the public service. And now my new work, I suppose I'm meeting an awful lot of people who are in a similar situation to me where they've made a decision to leave public service or to leave their work, whichever, even if it wasn't in public service, for some of the very, very similar reasons. So I know that a lot of things I'm going to say are not unique to the public service, and they're certainly not unique to education. And in fact, what I'm beginning to kind of realize is actually a lot of this is much broader than the organizations, whatever heading you might fall under, or whatever heading of whatever company you might be engaging with. So it may not be in the context of us being a staff member and employee, but being a service user or a customer or a client of a particular group or organization. It's not really about, whatever acronym is above the door or whatever. This is, I think, much more endemic actually in Irish society. And the more I thought about this coming into today, the more I kind of really started to consider, and I know something that I mentioned before at another event with Katrina O'Toole and the crew in Maynooth, is that I really don't feel like we as a society or as a nation have really fully come to terms with the trauma of our past. And I say past very, very loosely because I think we like to think of it as being in our past, when in reality it's within our current generation. An awful lot of these traumas have been perpetuated and indeed empowered, in fact. So I suppose, I know, Jane, you and I would kind of recognize how systems such as the education system, such as the justice system, are I suppose they're inherited by us as a nation, and they are not necessarily a good match culturally for us, in fact. So that's what I mean by kind of perpetuated. These kind of traumas are still being perpetuated through the systems and through the organizations, the institutions that we have within our country. So I suppose I struggled a little bit with kind of containing myself today, to be honest, and thinking, okay, I really could go off and really start talking about, our Celtic heritage, because I think actually there's a real gold mine there for us. It's the end. It's, for me, it's kind of somewhat at the end of the rainbow stuff, that we can actually go looking at. And if we look at the rise of interest in the likes of restorative practice, for example, and look at the origins and some of the nature, some of the ideas behind restorative practice, we begin to recognize it as kind of, that Breton law, like some of the stuff that we would have had, back before the days of kind of, the empire, etc. But we do have an awful lot of legacy issues. And some of that has to do with the empire. Some of that has to do with the church and how a lot of those things are still being perpetuated through the institutions that still hold a huge amount of power in our country, and for us, even in our language, how we interact with one another on a day-to-day basis, very subtle, but they are still, perpetuated in our use of language. But I suppose I am really here to talk more about kind of the systemic trauma, the stuff that's a bit more kind of maybe close to home, not the whole nation. Okay, so I tend to do that. I kind of go through the kitchen sink out and everything but to bring it back, I suppose, just to be thinking about, systemic trauma. And I think one of the reasons it came up so much for me the last time was because we were talking so much about how individuals experience trauma. And I think we run a really, really tight, we walk a fine line there with kind of beginning to use trauma and the likes of ACEs in a way to pathologize people. So the very thing we were trying not to do, I think that the systems that we have actually can use that and actually just turn it on its heels to perpetuate and to maintain the status quo. So instead of us saying, okay, look, we're going to diagnose people with, ADHD or opposition to defiant disorder or depression or anxiety, we're going to say, well, they have a lot of ACEs, so what do you expect? What can we do with people who have 5 ACEs or 3 ACEs and So it's just another way of pathologizing the individual, and it abdicates the responsibility from the system, which is, I suppose, where I'm really wanting to shine the light. And it's not about it's not about this or that. It's actually, we need to have both. We need to be advocating and articulating and raising awareness around individual experience of trauma, and raising that awareness that, a traumatic event is not, it's not experienced the same way by several people. A singular traumatic event is not really necessarily what trauma is about either. It's about a life experience and all sorts of complexities involved there. But it is, I suppose, for me, it is about making sure that that doesn't become the sole conversation piece when we talk about trauma. It really is about, how do our systems engage with individuals? How do our systems serve, to respond to people? How do we connect? How do our systems connect with people? Or how do they simply serve to perpetuate the status quo? How do they just kind of keep that humming along? And this is where, we really need to have that conversation, I think. So when we think about systemic trauma, we're thinking about the practices of our institutions, the procedures, the policies of our systems, things like that. So oftentimes we can be met with a lovely kind of strap line of a vision statement or a mission statement, and really not even worth the paper that they're written on. What we really need to do is start looking at maybe some of the language that's being used by the people within the organization. And this is, and I stress, this is actually not about those individuals. This is about the language that's been allowed to be used within an organization. Because what ends up happening is that people, in order to survive in an organization, can adopt the language that's accepted within their organization. So, when we talk about systems, I totally recognize that systems are comprised of people, but it is a collective, and there is an energy beyond individuals as well that is allowed and is endorsed, and people will survive within systems in much the same way as a traumatized child will find all sorts of ways to survive. And some of those ways will look like behavior, some of it will look like a use of language for them. And that compassion that we bring to that individual child, we need to also turn to people who work within an organization. So I think an awful lot about how teachers have been like really just treated so poorly through social media, through the pandemic. And I can't get over that. And that's not unique to Ireland either. That is, from what I can see, an international issue with how teachers are treated. And I find that actually deeply upsetting when I think of the teachers that I know who are working within the system, who are doing courageous work and brilliant work. And so often in their school systems or in their college systems, they are simply surviving themselves. So I think we have to be quite compassionate when we talk about systemic trauma, because it's not the devil. Similarly, like a child who is presenting with having difficulty getting his needs met or her needs met, we don't actually demonize that child. We understand that child, we come to that child with compassion. Similarly, people within systems need to, I suppose, engage with compassion. We need to engage with systems with that level of compassion as well, which is really, really difficult. That's the thing. But I think there is something about, the leadership within our systems and whether or not they are, I suppose, humble enough. Humility is a word that keeps coming up for me, to be honest, when I think about systemic trauma. And where is the humility? Where is the generosity of spirit? Where is the compassion in those leadership spaces? And it takes huge bravery to be courageous and to be generous and humble, in those leadership spaces at a time when some of these institutions, some of these organizations are being battered and bruised. And it does make me think about the whole idea that if we were to think about an individual child, and we were to ask them to I suppose, to take a risk. I suppose that's the thing. Like a lot of times when we're working with children, we're asking them to take risks, to trust us. And we know that that's a big ask for a child that is, whose experience of relationships has maybe not been fantastic, that the relationships aren't something that can be trusted. When we think about many of the leaders, we sometimes forget that actually they were children too, and they're carrying their own wounded child within inside them. And, to take a risk, we know that with the child, they need to have lots of safe relationships so that they can feel that they can access that part of their brain to be creative and to kind of be allowed to kind of fail and to do it better the next time type of thing. So there's something about creating that psychological safety. And I love Amy Edmondson, she's a behavior scientist. She talks about that psychological safety is this shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. I think that's really important because this takes it away from the individual and away from the system into the team. And it's much more manageable to think about it in terms of a team, perhaps, and this idea of psychological safety. And how do we create that space to take risks? So we have to build the trust of a team. And I think for me, this speaks to group theory. All of Yalom's work, about the curative factors of group, which is often absent from some of the discussion around trauma. In fact, is the cure, those curative, protective, therapeutic factors that we get from working in groups. And yet again, when we go back to the restorative practice, it is about the group. It is about the community holding you, and I love that, the phrase that it's the African proverb, and I think somewhere somebody has actually named it as it's kind of coming from a particular place. But it's the child who doesn't feel the warmth of the village will burn it down, that idea. But actually the village is it. That's what we need to focus on is the village. Let's create these warm places, these safe places for people to feel connected. Because once we feel connected, once we have that trust, then we can start being creative. Then we can start taking those risks that we really need. And so I'm a big believer in this whole idea of teams and of groups, because I think they can be very, very supportive. They can be restorative for us. And this is where I suppose the likes of, your reflective practice groups, your supervision groups, whether it's peer supervision or whether it's coaching, it doesn't really matter. It matters about coming together and creating that psychological safety that will allow us to be much more creative. And that's what will give us that space then to utilize new language, different language, creative language that can then seep into policies and practices and procedures, because it's within that kind of group space that we can kind of begin to, take the risk of looking at the policies and procedures and practices that are holding up the status quo and say, are these trauma informed? Are these policies, practices, and procedures, are they going to can help us connect with our clients, connect with each other, create a safe environment for us all to work together, to engage in, and to serve our clients, whether they are students or members of the public, whoever they are. So I suppose, so it's, and I will say this about systems. Systems are complex, but complexity isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, sometimes I think that complexity gives us lots of opportunities, in fact, to intervene and to intercept. And when one kind of maybe is exhausted for a particular reason, we can go to it from a different angle. So much like how trauma is complex, systems are complex. And I know that, like, I've done a huge amount of work in the whole area of suicide and suicide prevention. And that's one of the things I really look at when it comes to suicide. It's actually it's so complex, such a complex issue. But within that, there's many points to provide a scaffold or to provide an intervention or an intercept or whatever. So, it's the same thing here with systems. There's many points. There's the point where we engage as the customer and the client, the point where we engage as an employee, as the manager, the external support, whichever it is. But there's huge opportunities there to disrupt systemic trauma and just acknowledge the amount of traumatized organizations there are. So there has to be healing within so many of these organizations before they themselves can be conduits of healing for the members of the public, whoever they're engaging with. I'm going to wrap it up there.
Thank you, Caroline, so much. It was certainly very, very interesting for me, and just reflecting on my own current work in a youth justice pilot project where it's multi-agency and we're trying to get buy-in from the guards, from child protection social workers, and particularly around information sharing, where there's a personal risk attached maybe to sharing information in someone's best interests. Because of the culture of shame and blame and accountability, it can be actually quite hard to create that psychological safety. And the other thing that I was thinking about is, the wounded leaders that we have, which is no doubt the case, and the need for risk taking. Well, why would you take risks if you're going to be exposed and raked over the coals maybe by the media? We're in a climate of, cancel culture at various levels, so risk taking is quite dangerous. But then the power of the collaboratives, if enough people are saying the same type of things across systems, it gives a kind of maybe a buffering or insulation power to people. And the other thing is, we are all vulnerable. So regardless of your position in life, leaders are vulnerable too to that. They can be booted out or certainly shamed publicly for things that go wrong, and sometimes rightly so. But they are operating in a stressful, dysregulating environment oftentimes. So lots there to think about and mull over, Caroline. So thanks so much for that. Next up, we have Mary Delaney, who is going to talk to us about the education context. So it follows nicely on, I think, from Caroline's points about the plight of teachers and the stresses on teachers, and the fact that the role isn't always socially valued as it might. So Mary, I welcome you. The floor is yours for approximately 10 minutes as well. Thanks so much.
Okay, Jane, thanks very much. And thanks for the invite. Yeah, I found myself agreeing with so much there that Caroline was saying. So I suppose what I was thinking about maybe is to come about this from looking at really for trying to bring trauma-informed practice into schools, like what helps and what doesn't help. And I suppose just on my own background, I said to Jane, I think when we first discussed this, I think I'm like one of those dodgy building companies that I keep reinventing what I do under a different package in the hope that somebody will get the message and take it on board in schools. So my big thing would be about how we engage more children in education and in learning, because we do know that education, and particularly mainstream education, is one of the biggest protective factors. You know, we talk a lot about ACEs, but we don't talk so much about the benevolent childhood experiences. And we do know that protective factors are, you know, good available adults. We talk about that one available adult, but actually a lot of these children need more than one. And, you know, someone that's there to help you process it or to listen to you. So I guess that's where I'm coming from with all of this. I was a teacher and I retrained as an educational psychotherapist in a desperate search to find anything that would work with a certain group of kids I was working with. Most of my career, I've worked with children very much on the fringes of gangs, exclusion. And I suppose when I talk to schools, we now have a social enterprise called Trauma Responsive Education. One of the stories I often start with is when I live now in Cork. You might have gathered by my accent, I'm not originally from here. When I first came to Cork, I was asked to work with a boy who really reminded me of a boy I worked with in the UK. Both of them had well-known criminal fathers, very well known in the areas that they lived in. Both of their fathers had been killed in very violent and public circumstances. Both of them then had mothers that didn't cope in terms of either going into alcohol or prescription drugs. They had siblings in prison. They kind of had a real reputation. One of them ended up serving time for manslaughter in prison. One of them is now a senior educational psychologist. I don't know if that's good or bad, but he's certainly got quite a lot of power in his life now. The only difference I would say in their circumstances was one was kept in mainstream education by hook or by crook by certain teachers and certain establishments that just hung on to him, despite many attempts by him to get thrown out. And I think, you know, when you talk to teachers, you need to say, the other thing I often ask them is, why'd you do what you do? We have to sort of bring it back to what is it you went into it for? Because it is tough. And I think when we hear these things sometimes about trauma, and I hear these things about you just have to love the children, you know, as a teacher, I'm like, believe me, mate, it's not that easy. And that isn't just enough, because there's so many other pressures, so many expectations on schools. So when we talk to schools, thinking about what is trauma, one of the things that I think is an eye opener for them is I'm not just talking about a major trauma like a car crash or a war, that, you know, it could cover a whole gamut of loss, abuse, neglect, domestic violence, addiction, all of which can happen across the socio-economic board. It's not just about desh schools, for example, although we know poverty is one of the major factors. But even things like living in chaotic, inconsistent environments, perhaps with adults that are doing their best but are not coping very well, can affect the brain, can trigger things in you. That's always a big eye opener for schools. And the other thing that I get sometimes is, can you do it without mentioning the word trauma? And I'd be like, well, no, because that actually is part of the issue. These children are in our schools. They are showing you what is happening to them already. Because, and it's interesting what Caroline said about the history of Ireland, because there is a bit of a culture of not naming stuff and keeping things silent and not naming it for what it is. So one of the things we do have to do is challenge that and say, no, this is what it is. And it's not going to, we're not opening a can of worms. I mean, that's the other thing I think, that we think that we're opening a can of worms, or what I often get is, I'm not a social worker, Mari. And what I'd say, no, I know you're not. But as a teacher or somebody working in schools, our job is to facilitate learning. This trauma stuff, or whatever you want to call it, is a learning block in the same way as dyspraxia, dyslexia, anything else is getting in the way of them settling to learn. Therefore, it is our job to know about it, and it is our job to think about how to address it. I think you have to link it with what they think their job is. It's no good just appealing to their better natures, because there's too many pressures up from the curriculum and the system on them. So one of the useful things, so therefore I think it's about finding frameworks for thinking that actually make sense. So the one I often talk about is just that basic Gabor-Maté thing of trauma being a wound, the original meaning in Greek being a wound of traumata. And we've got wounded individuals and staff and children in our schools at the moment, visible or invisible. And what do you need to do with a wound? You have to try and heal it somehow. The other frameworks, I think, if you talk about the brain and the neuroscience, this is what I've learned over the last 20, 30 odd years, teachers can understand that. It feels safe. You're talking about psychological safety. It feels safe to understand that, you know, for example, some children might be very much in their fight, flight, freeze brain. And when they're triggered, it's not about something you're doing. It could be something else that's happened to them. And Bruce Perry's 3 R's, you know, regulate, relationship, reason. What brain are you in at the moment? What do you need from the adult? What can the adult give you? And that stops sometimes. The other thing I say often to schools is you're already doing some of this stuff. You don't call it that, but let's look at what's working and do more of that rather than fix on the problem. You know, our education systems across the world are full of things that don't work, but we keep doing them because they should. So punishment and sanctions is one of them. Exclusions is one of them. But, you know, it quite blatantly isn't working. And often it's perceived wisdom. It's to do with the training of teachers. They're told certain things will work. They're quite blatantly not. So we just keep doing more and more of them because they should. Instead of kind of thinking, hang on a minute, let's take a step back. Let's look at this really creatively. The other thing I think can be really useful is to look at what's going on in the interactions between us and the children sometimes. So unconscious defense mechanisms like transference, you know, to understand that that child is not having an interaction with you, they're having an interaction with an adult that you remind them of. So the reason I think that's important, for example, is to understand that some children don't trust calm, quiet adults because they're used to angry, shouty ones. And unconsciously, they may evoke that in you. And unconsciously, you then might feel guilty. And, you know, if you think about that, that's the cycle of domestic violence. Projections, you know, a lot of feelings that can't be contained are projected into the adults in a school. And when you go to staff, when I do a staff training, I often can tell what they've been dealing with by the way they behave in the group, because basically they act out mostly what the children are like that they're dealing with. And some of them are outrageously badly behaved and do all the things that they don't want the kids to do. But actually, when we start talking about projections, we often think they're getting a lot of stuff into them. And the reason I think that's important is you're often told as a teacher, don't take it personally. You know, it's very hard not to take it personally if someone called you a big fat cow and you were at Weight Watchers last night and you put on 3 pounds, because that's when that child will say it to you. You know, one of my colleagues, when I trained as far as an educational psychotherapist, had a much better way of saying it's not meant for you. Most of what happens and is coming into you is not meant for you. And I think that's a very useful reframe. I suppose the other thing I find useful is to let them understand that toxic stress, how it affects your working memory and your ability to do things in school, like follow instructions, remember what you've just read, you know, copy down from the board. All these things are really hard to do if toxic stress has impaired your working memory. And the reason I go on a bit about that is something that teachers will see as their job. So it kind of will make sense to them. I suppose the other thing, it's interesting again about generationally, a big realization for me was Brené Brown's thing, the difference between shame and guilt. You know, the first job I ever had was with a group of kids that were supposed to be trying to maintain them in mainstream, but they ran around like, well, technical term would have to be they ran around like lunatics, and were very de-schooled. And I realized at one point I thought the only thing I'm instilling in these children is Catholic guilt, which I ran away from all my own life. But Brené Brown made me realize, you know, guilt can be a positive thing in that I did something, it was a mistake, there's a consequence, and maybe there's something I can do about it. Shame is I did something bad, I'm a bad person. So we should be talking about shame and Catholic shame, not Catholic guilt. And I think there are many, many practices that are considered good practice in schools that are shaming. You know, from very simple things like writing on the board who hasn't done their homework, you know, to more sort of, sorry, I've got a bit of feedback here. I don't know if it's just me. So Yeah, sorry, yeah, attendance awards. Don't get me started, Sandra, on attendance awards. But what I find with a lot of staff I talk to is no one's ever said that to them before. So it's not that they're resistant. It's not that they're not compassionate, decent people. It's within the system they work in. Their training tells them these things. It's perpetuated by the experienced people in the school. It's about sometimes taking that risk. I think also staff are very driven by this. The drivers, I would say, are be perfect, even though we tell children it's okay to make mistakes. Try harder, like I said, try harder even though it's not working, instead of try differently. And be strong. So, you know, asking for help is seen as I'm incompetent. Offering help may be seen as that. So as Caroline was saying, creating these discussions where we can create a system that actually makes them feel it's okay to discuss things and say, I don't know. I would also say, as an educational therapist, I paid thousands of pounds to learn the phrase, I'm wondering. And I often say to schools, I give it to you now for a lot less money, because schools and training for teachers is set up. You're supposed to be a knower. You're supposed to be an expert. So you're supposed to have discussions about if that happens, what's the plan? What's the goal? What will we do? Tick the list. And if it's a short-term fix, even better. When actually it's messy. You know, these children that we're working with, there's not going to be an easy answer. It's not going to be an easy fix. There are times when we just need to say, this happened, I'm wondering what it means. I need to take a moment and wonder with the child. How often I've said to teachers, have you asked them? Have you asked the young person? Because again, we need to go from the expert to the getting alongside, being curious and wondering with them. So alongside that, you know, the whole thing about, do you listen to reply or do you listen to understand? You know, often when we're busy, we just listen to a young person to suggest things, to advise things, to know better them. It's very different to listening to the whole thing. And reframing language, I think we've talked about. I'm just aware of the time. I think I've probably gone over a bit. So I suppose for me, the biggest thing I think for schools to understand is that not knowing something does not mean you're incompetent. That collaborating or involving a child and a parent does not mean somehow that you've lost control. That it is your job to know about this stuff. And, you know, the cop-out of we've got 30 kids in the class, children actually know who needs more help. You know, they know instinctively which children need more help and more time. They will challenge you as the adult, but you need to have your answer about what you're doing. So supervision, I think, and reflective spaces for staff is really, really important because of the impact of the work on them, but also to allow them this space to think about it, take risks and be creative. And the other question I'd always say to them is, what's the smallest thing you can do that will make the biggest difference? Because that child that comes in late every day, that you say to them, late again, why is it always you? It's a very different response to, good to see you, are you okay? And that doesn't take time. So a lot of time is wasted on, as I say, stuff that doesn't work. Okay, I'll stop. I think I'm starting to rant now, so I better stop, Jane.
Thanks so much, Mary. Again, a really, really interesting and quite amusing in places contribution. I love the bit about paying thousands to learn the words I'm wondering, because it's so true. And there's so many, not just teachers, but many fields. Like if anyone professes to be an expert in any subject matter, that means that you're ill-equipped, or you're closing yourself off from not knowing the answer or exposing yourself. So I think it's so important to reflect on the fact that we don't know everything regardless of our experience, and the curiosity and kind of being alongside children and their families is really important. Also the bit about making it relevant to what teachers think is their job. So how the brain science and functioning and working memory resonates with them because that's relevant to the curriculum, I guess, their core tasks, rather than the more social work, touchy-feely side of things. and the opening the can of worms argument that often is raised in every context, I think is really relevant too. So thank you so much, Mary. I'm sure people will be delighted to discuss all these things shortly. We've just one more speaker now. I saw Fiona entered there. So Fiona Murphy is going to talk to us a bit about disability and how that can present issues in various contexts, including again in the classroom, but also in the criminal justice system. So Fiona, you have the floor. Welcome and thanks for doing this.
Great, thanks Jane. Yeah, so my name's Fiona Murphy and I'm involved in an initiative called the Irish Criminal Civil Justice and Disability Network, ICJDN for short. And basically it's a platform, it's to provide a platform whereby criminal justice agencies and disability advocates and organisations and service providers can kind of interact to improve the experience of those with the disability who engage with the criminal justice system. There's been numerous studies done, and I suppose one of the most recent publications last year from the IPRT showing that, you know, the amount of people in prison who have some sort of a disability or a neurodiverse condition, it's quite profound. The percentage of people in prison, and it is linked in as well, which myself and Jane discussed, you know, with trauma. Through the work, for example, we've been doing, I was at way back a criminal justice conference which was held in Wheatfield Prison. I think that was my first kind of introduction when basically to quickly go back, the conference was attended by the main criminal justice agencies, probation, DPP, members of the judiciary, the guards, the minister, and some non-profit organisations who work with ex-offenders, etc. And they showcased a programme that the Irish Red Cross had developed within the prison system, where prisoners themselves were educated in first aid to help other prisoners because of, you know, arguments and fights that were happening within the prison. And at the time in Wheatfield, it was a very, very tense environment. And those prisoners who got onto the programme had to have shown that they had, you know, reformed in some way, or, you know, they were embracing the opportunity to improve their lives before they went back out into society. And, you know, they would have been on various educational programs, and they would have been deemed as people who are really making an effort to reform. And they got up and they did a role play in front of everybody that was there around how you would save somebody's life. So somebody has a cardiac arrest and somebody's narrating the story, and there's two prisoners acting out how the person has a cardiac arrest and how they're going to try and save him with CPR. And it really struck me, I was sitting beside the director of the probation service at the time, it really struck me that some of these prisoners were only learning about nurture through doing this course. And it was one of the saddest things I think I've ever witnessed, that these grown men had never learned how to mind each other or look out for each other until they've done this program. And it was a very successful program that's been rolled out to prisons beyond Ireland. So that was one thing that really struck me, that essentially a lot of people who end up in prison, you know, the state has failed them in some way in early childhood, and, you know, people take various roads. So getting back to, anyway, the ICJDN, it's to look at people with disabilities and neurodiverse conditions and how they are treated, I suppose, in the first instance by guards and their encounters on the street. And when we looked at how this could be improved, a lot of the time people were looking at it from the perspective of, oh, they're in a guard station, how do you communicate with them? What's the environment like? Is it is it suitable for somebody with a disability to communicate? Do they need somebody else? Do they need a third-party intervention to assist them? And we were saying, no, before you even get into a guard station, we have to look at how we communicate with people out on the street. So you could have a person with autism, for example, who's used to taking a certain route. One wonderful example a parent gave us was of their son, who's on the autistic spectrum, got a part-time job, and they worked on I think it was a Saturday afternoon and a Sunday afternoon, and it was in Drumcondra. So she walked, you know, the route to work with her son, and they got into a little routine. And then the mother, and luckily for this child, had a wonderful advocate, and her mother was going, oh my God, what are we going to do with match day? What are we going to do on match day when he wants to walk down Jones's Road and it's closed off and the guards stop him and he doesn't understand why he can't take his route to work? How can escalate very quickly, because they could easily say, well, you know, have you got a ticket? Why do I need a ticket? I've never needed a ticket coming down this road before. And all of a sudden there's this confusion, and it can escalate very quickly depending on the individual involved. Now, that mum preempted the situation, but there's lots of situations on the street where there could be a policing issue or a crowd control issue, and they stop somebody, and when the person resists, it automatically escalates, and that person can end up in the back of the squad car. So it's around, what we were trying to do was start with this disability awareness training on the street first, before we even talk about how the DPP decides to prosecute or determine whether somebody can give evidence or not. So when we had conversations with the guards about this, they asked us to try and come up with some sort of a training, some sort of training materials that would assist them. And I suppose what our organisation isn't just there to advocate for people with disability, it's also to see the perspective of the people working in the criminal justice system. So you're looking at it from a guard's perspective, and they have to learn about the law, they have to learn this, they have to learn that, you know, apart from their own training and God knows what else. And then they're presented with this idea that they have to learn all about disabilities and how people present, and you know, there's so many types of disabilities. It's quite intimidating for them. They're going, do I need to take this on as well? So what we were trying to explain was, no, you don't. You just look at the person in front of you and you determine if they need additional supports or not. It's that simple. It's nothing to do with the disability. It's to do with how the person is presenting in front of you. And you need to take a step back and question why a person might be behaving the way they're behaving, or why they might be reacting the way they're reacting. Obviously, you know, it sounds all wonderful. You know, this is in a situation where nobody's life is in danger, which is most of the time when they're interacting on the street. So we came up with a training technique called the PARC technique, which I've, you know, discussed with Jane, which is actually quite useful for any situation where you're communicating with people. And the PARC technique stands for pause, assess, relate, and communicate. So, you know, because disability is cross-demographic, it doesn't discriminate, and it can present in any encounter that we're in. People present in varying ways, and you know, there's no one size fits all. So you've got to take the person for who they are that's standing in front of you, and try and assess what's going on for them. So when you just pause for a minute and you go, okay, this person is getting a bit stressed here, or, you know, getting wound up. Why are they doing it? You know, automatically a guard would assume that they're just reacting very badly. And, you know, when I was growing up, you wouldn't dream of challenging anything a guard said to you. So when somebody challenges it, then instead of for them to see it as a challenge, that they take a step back and go, okay, you know, is this person being cheeky or just being badly behaved, or what is it that's causing this person to react the way they react? So again, to reassure the guards, we're saying you're not there to make a diagnosis, you're there just to recognize that this person has an issue, and if they have an issue, you need to change how you communicate with them. So there's just little tips that they can look at that would help them recognize if there's something else going on in terms of their behavior, their appearance, you know, how they speak, if they're speaking very bluntly or honestly to the point of rudeness, etc., displaying difficulty with understanding, having limited vocabulary, etc. So there's loads of little pointers that we give them to maybe help them assess whether there's something going on, and then to try and relate to them. So to try and change their communication style, and if they have difficulty comprehending something, trying to assist them with that, you know, and knowing where you need to relate to them with. So, you know, relate to them. Do they need time to process the information? Do they need time to concentrate on what they're saying? Have they an issue comprehending what you're saying? As we say to the guards, you have a notebook and pen in your back pocket, take it out and draw a picture. You know, there's, of course, if the situation is very serious, then there's, you know, the opportunities to bring in intermediaries, but there's a lot you can do yourself in the first instance, you know, before you get to a guard station and you make a decision whether you need to use an intermediary. Things about how they follow instruction or following directions to make guards aware that, you know, people with disability or neurodiverse conditions may have issues around that. Then applying various communication techniques, which is a whole set of tools for them. And then, so it's pause, assess, relate, and communicate essentially is what we want them to remember when they're encountering people in the street in very normal situations. They're not walking into a riot. You know, it's very normal, everyday policing situations. And just because they get a reaction they're not used to, they can very quickly jump to conclusions. And I think we can all do that. And it may not necessarily be a neurodiverse condition. It could be an early childhood trauma, it could be addiction. You know, we don't know what's going on in anyone's life. And as we've had these conversations before, there's always a reason for somebody's behavior. So that's where we started with the communication. And we've spoken with each of the state agencies around this and said, right, I think there needs to be consistency in the training across all the criminal justice agencies, and the PARC technique forms the foundation of that training. And then depending on the job of the particular agency, the training is developed accordingly. So for example, there's an opportunity for a prison officer to relationship build with the prisoner that a guard wouldn't have, for example, because their interactions over a shorter limited period of time. I also teach on an adult education program, and every day, you know, I firmly believe in that whole thing of taking a step back. And I really feel privileged because every day I'm learning from the people that I'm teaching. And sometimes I say to myself, who am I to decide that, you know, their approach is wrong or their interpretation is wrong and mine is right? You know, I think we need to, rather than singling people out for having disabilities, that this is society, none of us are the same. And to try and look at the individual rather than the diagnosis they may have or the disability they may have. And again, you know, in the particular program that I teach on, they're normally young adults with neurodiverse conditions or some sort of a learning disability. But we also have had, as I said to Jane, HSE referrals, and you can see how the trauma has impacted on their learning and impacted on their behaviour in the classroom and everything else, and using the same approach with them. And as you've all discussed, making sure that they feel they're in a safe environment is huge. But on that, you know, one of our learners, for example, I found her childhood was so traumatic that it was easier for her to go with all she knew than to have to recognize and acknowledge to herself that it wasn't an appropriate childhood. It's all she knows. So she's rejecting all she knows to try and make a better life for herself. And that's a massive ask for a 19-year-old child. I mean, you can only steer them in the direction that maybe one day, you know, they may sit down and work through that. But I think everybody, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, you've grown up, and there's parts of yourself that nobody likes to take a good hard look at. And so I think, you know, we have to be very sensitive to that as well. All we can do is keep pushing them in a particular direction, and then some of that work they're going to have to do themselves. And speaking of people coming from various different socioeconomic backgrounds and early childhood trauma, one of the other things that we've noticed from our work as well is that the trauma of families of prisoners and what those children and siblings or children of prisoners are put through. For example, you could have a family whose father is in Wheatfield, for example, and out of nowhere, they might decide to transfer that prisoner to Mountjoy. And for that family who may not have private transport, may have to now get 3 buses to go and see their loved one in prison, rather than taking the 1 bus that they were able to do to get to Wheatfield, for example, or, you know, the limited amount of time that they can spend with the person that's convicted. Another thing, I'm just quickly trying to go through some examples. One thing that one of the judges of the Children's Court said, and I found it very profound, that they'd have young adolescents in for maybe attacking somebody or for physical abuse or whatever, and they cannot understand why they're being sentenced for doing that when that's all they've experienced their whole life, and there's been no consequences for the people who've abused them. So they don't understand, they genuinely don't understand when they're standing in front of a judge why everybody's come down hard on them, when the people who've hurt them, nobody has been held accountable or responsible. So I just think that, I think we need to be just really mindful that there's people deserve the opportunity to make the best of themselves and should be supported in doing so. And that's including people with disability. And I suppose the ICJDNs, the whole point of it is there's been so many people who've been victims of crime where over the years, assumptions have been made that they don't have the capacity to give evidence because there was a structure that they had to fit. And the structure now needs to be adapted to allow them give evidence, because there's a lot of different ways that we can communicate without having to do it the way the courts are demanding it's being done at the moment. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And again, a bit different, but also following on with the education thread. Particularly poignant for me was that last bit about the boys being charged with assault and not being able to understand. And I can well get that myself, that if you've been beaten and abused your whole life and there've been no consequences, and then you assault someone, a friend or a stranger, and the book of the law is being thrown at you and you're a monster and you're a deviant now, that kind of disconnect is massive and seems very unjust. We're maybe moving slightly to understand that you can be a perpetrator and also a victim too, because that has been a long time coming, that realization. But many of our programs still do not try and target undigested trauma or even give people education about the brain and the body and survival responses and the like. So thank you very much for sharing the information about the PARC method and your group, and it definitely sounds like it has relevance beyond the specific disability context and the criminal justice agencies. So folks, I'm going to now